Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal. After receiving Elizabeth's rejection, Lucky didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't even ask why. He simply stood there in chilling silence, his expression unreadable, neither anger nor heartbreak, not even a hint of frustration. It was as if a switch had flipped inside him, one that severed his emotional connection to the moment without warning. And in that silence, Elizabeth understood. She recognized that this wasn't a man seeking understanding or reconciliation. It was someone letting go. Completely. That final glance he gave her, void of resentment yet also stripped of hope, told her everything she needed to know. He had already decided he would not try again. What Elizabeth didn't expect, however, was how swiftly he would disappear from her life. By dawn the next morning, he was gone. No text. No note. No explanation. All that remained was an empty suitcase half-tucked beneath the couch, and the engagement ring he had offered her only hours earlier, abandoned quietly on the kitchen counter like a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter neither of them had finished writing. Elizabeth was not entirely shocked. Deep down, she had always known this about Lucky. Or at least, she had always known this part of him, the part that longed for more than what she could offer. A man who romanticized the idea of permanence but was, by nature, incapable of sustaining it. His heart had always belonged to something intangible, the pull of the unknown, the thrill of reinvention, the illusion of freedom just beyond the next horizon. She had spent years trying to be the place he came back to, the home he could anchor himself in. But eventually, she stopped believing that love alone could cure his restlessness. Her refusal wasn't born of bitterness or betrayal. It came from clarity. She still loved him, but she no longer mistook that love as enough to hold him still. She needed someone who wouldn't vanish when the world became too quiet. Someone who wouldn't confuse stillness with suffocation. Someone who chose to stay not out of obligation, but because that's where his soul could finally rest. It was Jason who had seen the signs before anyone else. He had stumbled upon Lucky one late evening by the river, a cigarette barely lit between his fingers, its smoke curling into the darkness like a question that would never find an answer. Lucky had stood there silently, his eyes fixed on the far-off mist that hovered above the water as if he could already see the road that would carry him away from Port Charles. Jason had tried to reach him. Not as a rival for Elizabeth's heart, but as someone who had known Lucky long enough to understand what this silence meant. He didn't argue or try to change his mind, but he asked, in his own way, if this was truly what Lucky wanted. And Lucky had responded with a quiet nod, a shrug, and a single word, yes. It wasn't defiant, nor was it desperate. It was simply inevitable. He had made peace with the decision, perhaps even before Elizabeth had given her answer. This wasn't a spontaneous escape. It was a deliberate withdrawal from a life that had become too heavy, too structured, too real. Jason didn't follow him. He knew better than to chase someone who was already gone in spirit. Instead, he watched as Lucky's silhouette disappeared into the dense fog that curled along the riverbank. There was something final in that moment, something absolute. Jason had seen Lucky leave before, but this time, there was no promise of return, no hint of hope that he might find his way back. Just a haunting certainty that whatever Lucky was chasing this time, it wasn't just freedom, it was the last remnants of who he believed himself to be before the weight of domestic expectation had dimmed that flame inside him. And so, Jason returned alone, carrying with him the heaviness of knowing that sometimes, loving someone means accepting their need to go, even if it breaks your own heart to let them. Elizabeth went through the next few days on autopilot. She bathed Aiden, packed his lunch, showed up for her shifts at the hospital, and responded to concerned questions with the kind of calm detachment that only someone in shock could maintain. When friends asked if she had heard from Lucky, she shook her head gently, offering only the vaguest of explanations. He needed to leave, she would say, as if that was all there was to it. As if the depth of her silence wasn't masking a storm of grief, regret, and, perhaps most painfully, understanding. Because she did understand. That was the cruelest part of it all. She understood why he left. She even forgave him for it. What she couldn't do was explain to Aiden, when he asked where his father had gone and when he was coming back. She couldn't bring herself to lie and say soon. Instead, she knelt down, looked him in the eye, and whispered, "Daddy needed to go find something. But we're going to be okay." It wasn't a promise. It was a prayer. Some nights, she would find herself reaching for the ring on the counter, tempted to slip it onto her finger just to remember how it felt. Other nights, she would walk past it without looking, afraid that touching it would reopen a wound that hadn't yet begun to heal. And yet, even in the absence, Lucky remained. In the small moments. In Aiden's laugh. In the sound of a motorcycle roaring in the distance. In the memories that refused to fade, no matter how tightly she tried to close the door behind him. But Elizabeth no longer waited. She no longer hoped. She had chosen to stay, and that choice was a quiet act of defiance against the pattern of departures that had shaped her life. Lucky's departure wasn't marked by drama or fireworks. It wasn't written in headlines or whispered in scandal. It was quiet. Like him. A man who came and went like a ghost, loved fiercely but never stayed, and left behind a trail of hearts that had once believed they could be enough. He didn't leave out of malice, nor out of cowardice. He left because he was lucky. And that, perhaps, was the most heartbreaking truth of all. News of Lucky's sudden departure from Port Charles spread through the town like a wildfire igniting dry brush, fast, unforgiving, and impossible to ignore. It didn't take long for whispers to become conversations, for speculation to evolve into resignation. Everyone seemed to have their own version of why he left, but only a handful knew the truth, or at least the emotional weight behind it. Lulu was among the first to hear, and though she tried to remain composed, tried to present herself as understanding and supportive, the truth flickered behind her eyes with every forced smile and tightly clenched jaw. Her heart ached not just from missing her brother, but from a deeper frustration that he had once again chosen the path of solitude over connection, adventure over family. She had seen this pattern before, and each time it repeated, it left another layer of bruising on her spirit. But still, she offered him grace, because she knew he was chasing something he couldn't name, and maybe never would. Laura received the news with a kind of quiet stillness only a mother could master. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. But inside, she crumbled just a little more. She had spent most of her adult life watching her son walk away from things that might have anchored him, love, responsibility, fatherhood, even peace. She had seen him go, seen him return, and seen him go again, each time hoping it would be the last. Not because she wanted to clip his wings, but because she wished he could finally realize that home wasn't a cage. It was a sanctuary. Still, she understood. She always had. Lucky had inherited more than her smile and his father's charm, he'd also inherited their curse, a soul that refused to rest in stillness. Laura quietly lit a candle at home that night and said a prayer not for his return, but for his safety and clarity, wherever his journey led him next. Meanwhile, Elizabeth lived through the days that followed in a haze of carefully constructed normalcy. She arrived at the hospital at her usual time, smiled politely at her colleagues, and offered the same nurturing care to her patients as she always had. But there was a dullness behind her professionalism now, a hollowness in her movements, as though each task were simply muscle memory rather than engagement of the heart. No one dared ask too much, but everyone noticed. And when someone inevitably mentioned Lucky, whether in passing conversation or with the innocent curiosity of someone unaware of what had transpired, Elizabeth's composure would falter for the briefest of moments. Her breath would catch, her eyes would cloud, and she would look away just long enough to find her footing again. The hospital's bustling corridors did little to distract her from the aching emptiness that had settled in the quiet corners of her life. At home, the silence was louder. Aiden, perceptive beyond his years, sensed the shift before he even asked. One night, curled beside Elizabeth as she read him a story, he looked up and asked where Daddy had gone. Elizabeth, with a softness that masked her internal trembling, told him that Lucky had gone away for a while to do something important for himself. She chose her words carefully, not to mislead, but to protect. Aiden simply nodded, accepting her explanation with the solemn grace of a child who knew not to ask more than what was offered. He leaned into her embrace and whispered, "I'll wait for him." It nearly broke her. Because she knew what her son couldn't yet understand, that waiting for Lucky was like waiting for a tide that might never return to shore. She kissed the top of Aiden's head and held him tightly, mourning not just Lucky's absence, but the innocence of a child who still believed that some people always come back. In the solitude of her bedroom, Elizabeth replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, not to change the outcome, but to make peace with it. She hadn't pushed him away. She had simply stopped holding on to an illusion. Loving Lucky had always felt like reaching for something beautiful in motion. A comet streaking across the sky, breathtaking but fleeting. He was never meant to stay. And perhaps, deep in her heart, she had always known that. But that didn't make the loss any less painful. What they had shared was real, even if it wasn't lasting. And now she had to carry that love alone, fold it gently into memory, and find a way to keep moving forward without being haunted by its echo. For Port Charles, Lucky's departure was just another shift in the ever-changing narrative of the town's turbulent history. But for the people who had truly known him, truly loved him, it was something else entirely. It was the quiet unraveling of a hope that had held on too long. It was the painful acknowledgement that some hearts are built for departure. And for Elizabeth, it was one more lesson in letting go, not out of anger, but out of love. Because if she truly loved Lucky, then she had to honor the truth that his heart had never belonged to anything permanent. It had always belonged to the road, to the horizon, to the unfulfilled dream waiting just beyond the next goodbye. Port Charles continued to move forward with the same erratic rhythm that had always defined it, a city that never truly slept, never truly healed, and never paused long enough for its wounds to close. Beneath its surface charm and the polished facades of hospitals and penthouses, the town breathed with a volatile energy that seemed to pulse through every corridor, courtroom, and conversation. Lives intertwined, secrets collided, and betrayal simmered just beneath the surface like lava waiting to erupt. In this chaotic heartbeat of the city, Drew found himself unraveling at an alarming pace, consumed by a storm of fury he no longer knew how to tame. His vendetta against Michael had morphed from something rooted in betrayal to something far darker, obsessive, calculated, and almost vindictive. What had once been about Willow and a fractured romance had become a mission of destruction. He was no longer just a man nursing emotional wounds, he was a man determined to burn bridges so thoroughly that no one could ever rebuild them. Drew's every move now seemed engineered to sabotage what little remained between Michael and Willow, manipulating court filings, leveraging past indiscretions, and planting narratives that cast doubt on Michael's stability as a father and partner. His anger was blinding, and the collateral damage was piling up faster than anyone could control. Nina, watching from the sidelines, couldn't stay silent anymore. Her disappointment in Drew had grown beyond simple frustration. It had evolved into pure indignation. She confronted him not with accusations, but with an anguished cry for decency, warning him that his actions risked tearing apart Willow's future with her children. To Nina, Drew's crusade no longer resembled heartbreak, it reeked of ego and vengeance. And what terrified her the most wasn't just the potential loss of custody, it was that Drew no longer seemed to care who he hurt in the process. Meanwhile, Alexis was spiraling into a quiet panic of her own. What began as a few inconvenient whispers had snowballed into the very real threat of exposure. The secrets she had buried so deeply, decisions made long ago under duress, compromises that once seemed necessary, were now crawling back into the light. The signs were unmistakable: veiled questions from reporters, unusual requests for access to legal files, the sudden resurfacing of names she hadn't spoken in years. Alexis, once the unshakable legal powerhouse of Port Charles, found herself tiptoeing through every conversation, unsure who she could trust, second-guessing every decision she made. The anxiety clung to her like a second skin, disrupting her sleep, her work, and her already strained relationships. She knew a reckoning was approaching, one that would not only threaten her career but potentially redefine how her daughters viewed her. And while the chaos unfolded around them, Jason remained the still center of the storm. But his stillness was not passivity, it was calculation. He had long since learned how to move quietly through darkness, how to uncover the rot at the heart of corruption without drawing attention to his own steps. His investigation into Dalton had deepened beyond a surface curiosity. What began as a favor for Anna had transformed into a complex web of deceit and danger, woven intricately with the help of Sidwell, whose quiet presence now felt more like a shadow than a man. The more Jason uncovered, the more he realized that Dalton wasn't merely a rogue academic. He was something far more sinister, a man operating with influence and intent that went far beyond the university. Connections to black market tech, offshore accounts, and rogue intelligence contacts emerged like puzzle pieces from the abyss, and Jason knew that Dalton's reach had already infiltrated deeper than anyone had imagined. And then there were the coincidences, too many to be ignored. Dalton's arrival in Port Charles, the timing of Lucky's abrupt departure, the inexplicable silence that followed. At first, Jason brushed it off. Lucky had always been unpredictable, drawn to the allure of disappearance. But as Jason traced Dalton's movements and their intersections with key players in town, he began to sense something more than coincidence. There were patterns. Overlapping names. Financial transfers. Surveillance footage with missing frames. Jason wasn't certain yet, but the suspicion had already begun to take root in his mind. Dalton might not be just another threat to Port Charles. He might be linked directly to the disappearance of someone Jason once called a brother. And somewhere, beyond the reach of phone calls or court subpoenas, Lucky's presence lingered like a ghost. Not physically, but in the hearts of those he had left behind. He was a name they still whispered, a memory that refused to fade. For those who had loved him, deeply, painfully, irrevocably, his absence was more than a void. It was a question mark, a wound that couldn't scab over because it never had the chance to bleed fully. Elizabeth moved through her days with a silent strength, never breaking, never crumbling, but never truly healing either. She didn't cry for Lucky. She couldn't afford to. But in the quiet of the night, when the world around her settled into its uneasy peace, she often found herself staring out the window, wondering if he was finally where he belonged. Or if he was once again searching for something he couldn't name, only to disappear into another horizon and leave behind another set of hearts waiting in vain. Lucky had always belonged to the road. That much was clear. He wasn't made for stability, for schedules, or for promises etched in stone. He was made for movement, for the thrill of chasing a purpose just beyond reach. And as much as Elizabeth had hoped he might change, that perhaps love and fatherhood would ground him, she knew better now. Some people aren't meant to be captured, no matter how deeply they are loved. Some souls are born to drift, even if it means leaving behind the very people who would have given anything for them to stay.